Todd from TS Wood and Leather. Today we're making the 150-year-old red pine slab coffee table. This log was found buried in a farmer's bog. After counting the rings, we determined it was over 150 years old. Kendal over at J&K Lumber gave me a couple slabs and commissioned me to make a coffee table. So the first step is to take these book-matched slabs and figure out which section I want to use to make the coffee table. So here I'm just wetting the slabs to see what the grain will look like when it's finished, and I'm taking a piece of chalk and marking out different sections, taking pictures to send to Kendal. These were the 3 pics that I sent to Kendal, 2 book matched and 1 possible river table. In the end, he decided on this section. It's beautiful. There's knots, lots of figure, and a lot of cracks. But that's the look he wanted, a rustic farm table with a lot of character, a lot of figure, and a lot of damage. So we started by cutting them to size and started flattening, sending them through the planer and the sander. This is what we ended up with. So I cut them roughly to size, and they were good and flat, so I decided I'll cut the joint. And the joint came out perfect. But unfortunately, things were about to take a curve, or a curl. You'll see. So the next process is to fill these cracks and stabilize these slabs. These slabs are very soft and fragile. The cracks in some places go all the way through. These slabs were buried in a farmer's bog for over 50 years. And then on top of that, the logs themselves are over 150 years old. Because they were buried, no air got to them, so they didn't rot, but they do have a lot of cracks from all that moisture freezing and thawing over decades. This was a really long process. This is the first pour of many over the next few weeks to fill these cracks. I covered the bottom side with packing tape covered with blue painter's tape to contain the epoxy, then torched it frequently to keep the bubbles out of the big cracks. Relieving the tension and adding the moisture from the epoxy made these slabs twist and curl and potato chip. I used these weights to counteract it. It worked okay, but I still had to flatten them again. I made a flattening sled out of a 3/4 inch thick piece of plywood and some hot glue to keep the planks from twisting in the sander. I repeated this process both top and bottom, back down to bare wood, but the cracks are still filled with epoxy. Next up, jointing the slabs together. I used the Dowelmax Dowel Jig. It's a 3/8 inch diameter dowel jig, super simple to use. I'm not sponsored by Dowelmax, but this jig is always in the top 5 list of dowel jigs. Just mark and drill your first hole, then take the adjustable gap guide and put it in the hole. Then clamp it down again and drill your next hole. And you just keep working down the slab. It's that simple. And then you work in the opposite reverse direction coming back on the other slab. It's foolproof. This thing is great. The basic 3/8 inch diameter kit costs a little over $100, but they have lots of accessories with different diameter holes, all sorts of stuff from Dowelmax. Now it's time for the dry fit and the glue up. I can't stress enough the importance of dry fitting things together before gluing them. You have to make sure everything lines up before gluing them, because once you got them glued together, that's it. Adding some Titebond III and the 3/8 inch dowels, extremely tight, no slop at all from the Dowelmax system. also adding some to the joint. Once I glue this up, I'm gonna clamp down cauls on either end to make sure it doesn't cup or twist while it's clamped down, and then just leave it overnight. So it's another round of filling cracks and dings before I do the seal coats on both the top and the bottom. I'm using liquid glass 24-hour curing epoxy. It's a thinner epoxy, which means it's easy to get the bubbles out. I'll use this epoxy as a seal coat for the top, bottom, and edges. Because it is a thinner epoxy, I'm going to have to apply it multiple times. But that's okay because this wood is so soft and so porous, it soaks up a lot of epoxy. I did all the coats of epoxy from the top down. That's to make sure there was no bubbles on the top. This is the bottom. Those are micro bubbles, but it's the bottom, so I don't care. The seal coat looks good, but I had to do multiple coatings. This wood is so porous, it just kept soaking up more and more epoxy, especially on the end grain, coming back every 15 minutes to torch the bubbles. My bubbles.
Again, this is the bottom, so I'm not worried about those. If I was, I'd have to go in and sand that out and get rid of those.
Little did I know, these bubbles were going to be the least of my worries.
On the end grain, I just put another coat on this, but the end grain, imagine the end grain is, well, it's like a set of straws sticking up like this, and the end grain is at the very tip of those straws where the opening is. So you'll have to reapply, and you'll notice this with varnish and paint and stuff too. You have to reapply more to it because it sucks any of those liquids into those straws, and so they dry out quick. So I'm going to keep reapplying to that until I get a good coating, and then we're going to be done for a couple days because this takes time to cure. I'm also going to hit, there's some bubbles down in this knot. I'm going to hit it with the torch to get rid of the micro bubbles. But man, oh man, that's going to look nice. And this is the bottom.
To add more epoxy to existing cured epoxy, you have to scuff it up with sandpaper to give it a physical bond for something to adhere to. All those scuffs and scratches magically go away as soon as you put on that next coat of epoxy. One of the tools I use for spreading epoxy is this little silicone trowel. This one's from Rockler. It comes in most of the epoxy kits. It helps you spread the epoxy without just scraping it from side to side like a trowel. This is one of the epoxies I use from a company called Super Clear. It's a really great epoxy, but like any epoxy, you got to read the directions, you got to mix it properly, and it has a shelf life. It doesn't last forever. Even when you do your best to try to follow the directions, projects can go sideways. example coming up next.
Okay, so I've got the epoxy mixed up, and this is what it looks like when you have a whole bunch of air bubbles in the epoxy. You can let it sit for a while. You can torch it. I have my torch here. You can put it in a vacuum pot. I have my vacuum pot over there. Or you can just wait a little while and then torch it. Or you can pour it and then just get the bubbles as it levels out. I'm gonna be watching this for quite a while, and I already got most of it. I have it leveled and I have it filled, so I'm not worried about bubbles creating in cracks and stuff. So I'm gonna just pour it.
At this point, I had already sanded this thing top and bottom 3 times to get rid of every last little bubble, and I just introduced millions of them to this piece of wood. Also, there were still little sucker holes that were still sucking epoxy down to the bare wood. I should have stopped and just sanded it again, but I didn't.
That's okay. So a second top coat is gonna go on right now, because it's nice and warm, so it's more fluid, which is good. Saves hassle of a little scorch.
I should not have done this.
No. Oh. Are you kidding me?
Yep.
Well, that's interesting. So, I mixed this only about 10 minutes ago, and it went thermal on me. I don't know if you can see it, but it is smoking. So, the bottom is still liquid, but the top is already solid. So that is something that happens with epoxy, and it is hot. I mean hot.
So hot.
So, yeah, good times. We'll mix up another batch. I'm gonna throw this outside so it doesn't set something on fire or melt through the floor. Got my top coat, and we're gonna dump it. And this bucket is already getting warm, which means that it's setting up. And I think I have an idea why this is already setting up. I think my epoxy might be getting old. Oh, this is gonna be, I can already tell this is gonna be a disaster. Oh, don't even. Son of a...
This is the base that Kendal wanted me to use for the coffee table. It was an old one, been laying around for quite a while. I just painted it and fabricated solid walnut plugs on the bottoms so I could insert the adjustable feet.
So I'm going to drill holes and insert these guys with wood screws, and then that's threaded, and we have adjustable feet. So they'll go inside that wood. That's good. And then we have brackets that I'm going to attach to the top, because these little tabs are not adequate. So I'm going to attach these brackets like this, and then they have larger slots. I'm going to screw in inserts. These are threaded inserts. So the inside is threaded, the outside has these really thick threads. That'll go into the wood. I'll epoxy these in so they stay permanent. and then line those up in basically the middle of the slot here.
This is a trick I use to attach washers and nuts to the end of bolts when their fingers are too big to go through the hole. I just take a little bit of wood glue, stick it on the end of my finger, and then I slide that washer or the nut on the end of the bolt. It doesn't always work, and sometimes I still drop the washer, but 9 out of 10 times I can get it on the end of the bolt without dropping it. Luckily, I can still get the end of a wrench in there to tighten it up. The tricky one can be the bolt. I have the hex head screwdriver in the end of the bolt, and I'm just going to keep twisting it until I feel the threads click into the nut. And then just tighten it down and repeat the process about 7 more times. Tighten it up with a small ratchet, and we're done. A simple base, semi-gloss black, looks classy. Now it has adjustable feet, and you can put it anywhere, and it'll be nice and level. It was only then that I realized that I had micro bubbles all over the top of this thing. I was nauseous. I was going to have to sand this thing again for the 5th time, re-epoxy, wait 2 weeks before I could even polish it. I was ready to turn this thing into firewood. It made me want to pull my hair out. All I could do was say, "Son of a..." So I sat down, I had a couple cups of coffee, tried to create a game plan. Yes, I was going to have to sand this thing for like 5 or 6 more hours and then recoat it with epoxy. The nice thing, though, is it's not the end of the world. And I have power tools. So after my Maniac 3-inch belt sander freakout, I got this thing taken down. It took me about 5 hours, got all the epoxy with the bubbles off, and I'm ready for the final coat of epoxy. So I mixed up another batch of epoxy called Liquid Glass. It's another product made by Super Clear. It's a great epoxy. It's a lot thinner and really easy to get the bubbles out. I also got the bubbles out of the epoxy before I poured it. This last coat of epoxy went on like hot butter. It is smooth, it is clear, there are no bubbles, and all I had to do was wait about a week before I could even think about flipping it over or touching it. In woodworking, there's almost always a fix. Just time, effort, and money, and you can do all sorts of things. One last inspection before I flip it over and put the base on. The inserts I showed you before are already in the tabletop. You just have to make sure that you don't drill through the top when you're inserting them. Use a stop collar or a piece of tape on your drill bit to make sure you don't drill all the way through. After they're installed, I use a Q-tip on the inside of the insert to get rid of all the residual epoxy. Last stage is to polish this thing to get rid of the little drip edge that's on the top and the bottom. There's a couple little drips on this knot. I'm going to get rid of that too. I start with 1,000 grit wet sandpaper and move all the way up to 4,000 grit wet sandpaper, and then get into polishing compounds. Almost 50 hours of labor put into this, a lot of back-breaking work, and a lot of waiting for the epoxy to cure. But you can't argue with the results. Now it's time for the big reveal. ETSwoodandleather.com. Follow me on Instagram. Like, subscribe, send to a friend. Love ya. See you.